The plan started the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and I didn't see it coming until it was already sitting at my dinner table. My daughter called that morning, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how cheerful she sounded, not her normal kind of cheerful, the kind where she asks how my knee is holding up or whether I've been sleeping enough. This was bright and performative, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed in the car. "Mum, we were thinking we'd come down a few days early. Help you get the house ready. You know how much work Thanksgiving is." I told her that would be lovely. I should have heard the rehearsal, I know that now. But she's my daughter, my only daughter, and when she says she wants to help, I want to believe her. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a mother in your 60s. You don't stop wanting to believe in your children. You just get better at noticing when something feels off. I noticed. I just didn't act on it fast enough. My name is Constance. I'm 67 years old. I live in the same 4-bedroom house in Knoxville, Tennessee, that my husband Leonard and I bought in 1989, the year our daughter Heather was born, and 2 years before our son came along. Leonard passed 4 years ago this November. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which is about as cruel as that disease gets, and it is always cruel. After he was gone, I did what people told me not to do. I stayed in the house. I kept his workshop in the garage exactly the way he'd left it. I learned how to manage the finances myself, something Leonard had always handled. And I went to a financial advisor named Sandra who sat with me for 3 hours and helped me understand exactly what I had and what I didn't. What I had was the house paid off, a retirement account, Social Security, savings, enough, more than enough if I was careful, which I am. What I also had was 2 adult children with very different ideas about what enough means. My son Christopher lives in Columbus. He's steady, practical, not particularly warm, but reliable in the way that a good smoke detector is reliable. You don't think about it until you need it, and then you're grateful it's there. He calls on Sundays. He asks sensible questions. He does not, to my knowledge, lie to me. My daughter Heather lives 40 minutes away in Maryville with her husband, a man named Scott whose handshake has always been too firm, the way men shake hands when they're trying to prove something. Scott sells commercial real estate. He's very good at talking about money in a way that makes other people feel like they don't understand it as well as he does. I never disliked Scott, that's important to say. I found him difficult to warm to, but I didn't dislike him. I thought he made Heather happy mostly, and I thought he was a decent father to their 2 kids, and I minded my own business. For 11 years of their marriage, I minded my business. That ended the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Heather and Scott arrived on Monday night. The kids, my grandchildren, 14 and 11, were dropped off at Scott's mother's house, which I thought was odd, but didn't say anything about. They brought wine and a store-bought pie and a folder. I noticed the folder immediately. It was sitting on top of Scott's roller bag when he came through the front door, a plain manila folder with a small stack of papers visible at the top. He tucked it under his arm when he saw me looking. "Just some work stuff," he said. We had a normal enough evening. I made chicken tortellini soup because it was cold and I knew Heather loved it. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about the grandchildren's school, about Scott's business, about whether I'd had the gutters cleaned yet. I kept watching that folder which Scott had set on the counter near the refrigerator. Just sitting there, work stuff. The next morning I came downstairs early, as I always do. I make coffee, I sit in the chair by the front window where I can see the maple tree in the yard, and I have 45 minutes of quiet before the world starts asking things of me. That morning, Scott was already up. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the folder open, papers spread in front of him, and a cup of my coffee that he'd helped himself to without asking. He looked up when I came in, and he smiled, and I saw it, just for a second, the calculation behind it. "Morning, Constance. Sleep okay?" I said I had. I poured myself coffee and I sat down across from him and I waited. He said he'd been wanting to talk to me about something important. He said he wanted to talk about the future. My future, he was careful to say. My comfort and security. And he reached across the table and slid the folder toward me. I didn't open it. "What is this, Scott?" He explained, slowly, carefully, in the tone of voice people use when they think they're explaining something to someone who won't understand it. He said that the house was sitting underutilized. He said that in the current market, and he used the phrase current market 4 times in 5 minutes, a property like mine, in a neighborhood like mine, had significant leverage potential. He said that if I were willing to take out a home equity line of credit, use the house as collateral, he had an opportunity, a very limited window opportunity, to triple our investment within 18 months. Our investment. I looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning with the maple tree outside, and Leonard's coffee mug on the shelf where I've kept it for 4 years, and I said very quietly, "Whose investment, Scott?" He shifted in his seat. He said of course he meant it as a family investment. He said he'd run the numbers. He said the risk was minimal. I said I needed to think about it. He said the window was narrow. I said I understood that. I said I'd think about it. Heather came downstairs an hour later, and I could tell from her face that she knew. Not just knew that Scott had brought it up. She was part of it. The way she looked at me across the kitchen, apologetic and hopeful at the same time, like a child who'd knocked something over and was waiting to see if they were in trouble. She'd known about this before they arrived. The folder, the timing, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, when sentiment runs high and families want to be generous with each other. All of it was planned. That's what hit me hardest. Not that Scott wanted something. I'd half expected Scott to want something at some point. That's who he is. What hit me was that Heather had stood in her kitchen in Maryville and looked at the plan and said yes. Yes, let's go to Mom's. Yes, let's go to Mom's. Yes, let's bring the folder. Yes, let's do it at Thanksgiving. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in the room where Leonard and I slept for 31 years, and I looked at the window and I thought about the conversation I'd had with my attorney 8 months earlier. I should explain that. Shortly after Leonard died, my financial advisor Sandra suggested I also consult an estate attorney, just to have everything in order. I did. I called a woman named Judith, who had been recommended by a friend at my church, and I spent 2 hours with her going over the will and the deed and the beneficiary designations on everything. Judith was thorough. Judith was also direct in a way I appreciated. She said to me, "Constance, you would be surprised how often adult children, or their spouses, create pressure around a surviving parent's assets. If anyone ever asks you to sign anything, you call me first." I'd thought at the time that I was lucky not to have that problem. Sitting on the edge of my bed that Tuesday morning, I took out my phone and I texted Judith. I told her what Scott had proposed. I told her about the folder. I asked her what I should know. She called me back within the hour. What she told me, and what I did not know, was that a home equity line of credit taken out the way Scott described would effectively put my house at risk if the investment failed. The minimal risk Scott had mentioned was not, in Judith's assessment, minimal. She'd seen this structure before. She wanted me to bring her the paperwork. She also told me something else. She told me to be careful about what I agreed to verbally before the papers arrived. She said pressure can come in many forms, including from people we love. I thanked her. I went back downstairs. The conversation over lunch was harder. Scott laid it out again, more detailed this time, more confident now that Heather was at the table. Heather reached across and put her hand on mine, and she said, "Mum, we just want to make sure you're taken care of. You're here alone in this big house and Dad would have wanted." I took my hand back. I said, "Your father would have wanted me to be careful." Scott's voice got tight. He said I was being short-sighted. He said this opportunity wasn't going to wait. Heather said I didn't understand how the market worked. And something in the way she said it, the same tone Scott used, the tone I'd heard him use with her, with the kids, with anyone he thought he could manage, I realized she'd learned it from him. My daughter had learned to talk to me the way her husband talked to people he wanted something from. I said I wasn't going to sign anything without my attorney reviewing it first. Scott put down his fork. He said, "Your attorney. Why would you need your attorney involved in a family decision?" I said that any decision involving my home required my attorney, family or not. And then Heather said it. She said it quietly, which somehow made it worse than if she'd shouted it. She said, "Mom, you're being selfish." I sat with that for a moment. Selfish. I had raised her in this house. I had gone back to work as a school librarian when she was 3 years old, because Leonard's income alone wasn't enough, and we needed the insurance. I had gone to every recital and every soccer game, and I had held her while she cried over boys who weren't worth her tears. And I had paid for 2 years of her graduate program because she'd run out of financial aid, and I hadn't wanted her to take on more loans. Selfish. I pushed my chair back and I picked up my plate and I said, "I think it's time to change the subject." Scott said they weren't finished. I said I was. I took my plate to the kitchen and I stood at the sink for a moment, looking out at the backyard where Leonard built the raised garden beds the summer before he got sick. And then I heard the voices behind me rising, not at each other, both of them at me, and I turned around. Scott was standing now. He had the folder in his hand, and he was saying something about how I was making a mistake, about how I was too emotional to see clearly, about how Leonard always said I let fear drive my decisions. He said Leonard's name like he'd known him, like he had the right. I said, "Please don't bring my husband into this." He said I was being irrational. And then it happened. I don't think even Heather expected it. She had picked up her wine glass. It was not even noon, but she'd poured wine with lunch, and she threw it, not at the wall, at me. The glass hit the edge of the counter next to my hip and shattered, and wine went across my hand and down my slacks, and a piece of the glass caught the back of my wrist and left a cut that immediately started bleeding. The kitchen went completely silent. Heather's face changed. She looked at her own hand like she wasn't sure it belonged to her. Scott took a step backward. I looked at the cut on my wrist. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding and it stung. I set down my plate on the counter. I picked up a dish towel and pressed it to my wrist, and then, without saying a single word, I walked to the hall closet where I keep my purse, and I got in my car. I drove myself to the urgent care clinic on North Shore Drive. The cut needed 2 butterfly closures, not stitches, but the nurse was concerned enough to ask me how it happened, and I told her exactly how it happened. She made a report. She gave me paperwork. I took the paperwork. From the waiting room, while I was waiting for them to finish the documentation, I texted Judith again. I told her about the glass. I told her I had the paperwork from urgent care. I told her Heather and Scott were still at my house. She replied in 4 minutes, "Don't go back tonight. Let them be there. I'll call you in the morning." I called Christopher. My son has his father's quality of silence, the kind that isn't empty, the kind that means he's actually listening. I told him everything, start to finish. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mom, I'm coming." I told him he didn't need to come all the way from Columbus. He said he was already looking at flights. I spent Tuesday night and Wednesday at a friend's house. Barbara, whom I've known since our children were in elementary school together. Barbara made decaf and let me sit in her living room until almost midnight just talking. She did not tell me how I should feel. She did not offer opinions about Heather or Scott. She just sat with me, which is the most useful thing a friend can do. I did not sleep much. I kept thinking about the house, not whether it was safe. I knew they wouldn't damage anything. They weren't vandals. I was thinking about the 32 years of life in those walls. Leonard's workshop in the garage, the height marks on the doorframe of the hallway, still there, where I'd measured Christopher and Heather every birthday until they left for college. The garden beds. Wednesday morning, Judith called. She told me that what had happened constituted assault. She said if I wanted to pursue it, I had documentation, the urgent care report, a nurse who'd taken my account. She said it was my decision entirely. She also told me that Scott had called her office Tuesday night. Apparently he'd looked up her name somehow, and left a message asking to speak with her about resolving a family matter. She had not returned the call. She said, "I'd like to come to the house with you on Wednesday afternoon, if you're willing. There are some things I'd like them to hear directly." Christopher landed in Knoxville at 11 Wednesday morning. I picked him up. We drove to the house together. I had a key, obviously. It's my house. What I also had was a code for the back door that Heather and Scott didn't know about. A door that opens into the laundry room from the side yard, which Leonard added when we renovated in 2011, and which we never put on any of the key copies we'd given to the children. I had given Judith the code the night before. When Christopher and I came in through the front door, we could hear Heather and Scott in the kitchen. We could hear Scott on the phone. We could hear Heather saying, repeatedly, "Just wait. Just let me handle it." Judith came in through the laundry room. She had a colleague with her, a younger man who carried a briefcase and said nothing the entire time. Judith walked into the kitchen and Scott stopped his phone call mid-sentence. I want to say it was dramatic. It was, a little. But mostly it was just quiet. That kind of quiet that happens when people realize the situation has changed entirely and they haven't caught up yet. Judith introduced herself. She said she was my attorney. She placed a document on the kitchen table, and she said that she prepared a response to the proposal from earlier in the week, and that the answer was no. She said the home equity proposal was declined in full. She said any future proposals involving my property or finances would need to be submitted to her office in writing. She then said very calmly that there was also the matter of the incident on Tuesday at approximately noon, which had resulted in a documented injury and an urgent care visit, and that I had the right to pursue that matter legally if I chose to. Heather started crying. Not the kind of crying that asks for comfort, the kind that's afraid. Scott said this was an overreaction. He said it was a family matter and that I had no right to bring an attorney into my own home. Christopher, who had been standing next to me without saying anything, turned and looked at Scott in a way I'd only seen his father look at people, and said, "That's enough." Scott stopped talking. I looked at my daughter. She was standing near the counter where the wine glass had shattered the day before. Someone had cleaned it up. There was no trace of it. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and I thought of all the mornings I'd driven her to school, and the way she used to put her head on my shoulder when she was tired. I thought about how much of myself I'd given to this person who was standing in my kitchen crying because she was caught, not because she was sorry. I said, "I'd like you both to leave." Scott started to object. Judith looked at him, and he didn't finish. They got their things. It took about 20 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table with Christopher and Judith while they moved around upstairs. Nobody spoke much. Judith drank a glass of water. Christopher made me a piece of toast because he said I needed to eat something, and I did need to eat something. When I heard the front door close, I let out a breath. I felt like I'd been holding since Tuesday morning. In the weeks after that, I changed the locks. I changed the code on the garage door and the back door. I updated my will with Judith, which I'd been meaning to do anyway, and in the new version I made adjustments that reflected reality more clearly than sentiment. I didn't write Heather out entirely. I'm her mother, but certain protections are in place now, legal structures that ensure any inheritance must be used for her direct benefit and cannot be accessed, managed, or controlled by a spouse. Judith told me that kind of provision is more common than people think. I wish I'd known that before. Scott has not contacted me since that day. I think Judith's presence made it clear that the path he was planning no longer existed. Heather called once, about 3 weeks later. She called from her cell phone at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, which meant Scott didn't know she was calling. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know why she'd done what she did, which I think was probably true and also, probably, wasn't the whole truth. I said I appreciated the apology. I said I needed time. I didn't tell her what I'd changed in the will. That wasn't the point. The point was that I was still standing in my own house, still waking up to the maple tree, still sitting in Leonard's chair every morning with my 45 minutes of quiet. Christopher came back for actual Thanksgiving, just the two of us, which was quieter than any Thanksgiving I'd had in a long time, and also, I realized, exactly what I needed. We made Leonard's cornbread dressing recipe, which requires more butter than any nutritionist would endorse, and we watched the parade and we talked about his kids and his job and whether I wanted to come to Columbus for Christmas. I told him I'd think about it. He said that was fair. I looked around the kitchen, the counter where the glass had shattered, the table where the folder had sat, the shelf where Leonard's mug still stands, exactly where I put it the day I came home from the hospital without him, and I thought, this is still mine, all of it, still mine. Nobody gets to take what belongs to you just because they're standing in your house and they've decided they deserve it. Not a stranger, not a son-in-law, not a daughter who forgot for a little while who her mother was. I raised her better than that, and I know that. I just had to remind her of it. I still think about that Tuesday morning sometimes. Scott at my kitchen table with his coffee he hadn't asked for, and that folder sitting open like it already belonged there. The way he smiled when I walked in. I've been turning it over long enough now to understand something I couldn't see clearly in the middle of it. What happened in my kitchen that week wasn't random. It was the result of a long chain of small choices made by all of us, arriving all at once at my Thanksgiving table. Scott made his choices. He decided my house was an opportunity, that my grief was a soft place to push, that a widow alone in a 4-bedroom home was someone whose no could be managed. Those choices had a cost, and by the time Judith walked through my laundry room door, that cost had come due. That's just how it works, not as punishment from somewhere above, just as consequence, plain and ordinary, the way a wall doesn't care how confident you were when you walked into it. But I made choices too, the ones I made early, calling Judith 8 months after Leonard died, sitting with Sandra, and actually learning what I had, keeping my own name on every document. Those choices are the reason I still have my home. I don't say that to congratulate myself. I say it because I almost didn't make them. I almost thought, the way many women my age were raised to think, that handling money and legal paperwork was something other people did for you. I had to unlearn that. Leonard was a good man and he meant well, but letting him carry all of that hadn't prepared me for the moment I needed to carry it myself. Wisdom isn't something that arrives with age automatically. You have to go get it, usually at inconvenient times, often when you're still grieving. What I know now is that the most important thing I did in those 2 days wasn't calling Judith, though that mattered. It wasn't keeping the urgent care paperwork, though that mattered too. The most important thing I did was recognize the moment for what it was and refused to let my love for my daughter cloud my judgment about what was actually happening. That is harder than it sounds. She is my daughter. She was crying in my kitchen. Every instinct I had wanted to make it easier for her, and that instinct, unchecked, would have cost me everything. There is a kind of strength that doesn't look like strength while you're doing it. It looks like pressing a dish towel to your wrist and walking quietly to the hallway to get your purse. It looks like sitting in a waiting room, filling out paperwork, when you'd rather be anywhere else. It looks like saying, "I'd like you to leave," in a steady voice when your heart is breaking a little. That's the kind of strength I had to find that week. Not the loud kind, not the kind that argues or retaliates, but the kind that holds the line without losing itself. Heather called. She apologized. I said I needed time, and I meant it. I love my daughter. I also changed my locks, and I don't apologize for that either. Christopher came for Thanksgiving. We made Leonard's cornbread dressing. We watched the parade. It was quiet, and it was good, and it was mine. That's what I want to hold on to. Not the folder or the glass or the look on Scott's face when Judith walked in. Just the quiet. Just the kitchen that is still, after everything, exactly where I live.